declare this 60th meeting of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts in order. Colleagues, I have no particular business to bring before you before we start, so unless someone else has an intervention, it'd be my intention to move us directly to the public hearing at hand. I see none. So therefore, we will move forward with on the hearing pursuant to Standing Order 1083G, Chapter 3, Tax-Based Expenditures of the Spring 2015 Report of the Auditor General of Canada, and that was sent to us April the 28th. Mr. Ferguson, our Auditor General, is here with us today to kick things off, and so to begin with your opening remarks, I'll turn the floor over to you. Mr. Ferguson, you now, sir, have the floor.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to discuss our 2015 Spring Report on Tax-Based Expenditures. Joining me at the table is Richard Domingue, Principal, who was responsible for the audit. The federal government can attain its policy objectives either through direct program spending or through tax expenditures. In this audit, we refer to the tax expenditures that could be replaced by direct spending as tax-based expenditures. In support of this point, the International Monetary Fund's Fiscal Transparency Code states that because the government policy objectives could be achieved alternatively through a subsidy or other direct outlays, tax expenditures are regarded as equivalent to budget expenditure. Les dépenses faites au moyen de système fiscal.
Tax-based expenditures account for billions of dollars annually. We looked at how the Department of Finance Canada and the Canada Revenue Agencies managed these expenditures. More specifically, we examined whether clear and useful information is reported, whether analyses are performed before the implementation of these expenditures, and whether existing tax measures are monitored and evaluated. We selected 9 tax-based expenditures. We found that the information provided by the Department of Finance Canada on tax-based expenditures does not adequately support parliamentary oversight. Although these expenditures are similar to direct program spending, less information is provided to Parliament about these expenditures than about direct program spending. For example, the Tax Expenditures and Evaluations Report does not include future cost projections. Reporting practices in some international jurisdictions provide examples where additional details related to tax expenditures are disclosed. The number of beneficiaries, the administrative costs, and links between direct spending programs and these expenditures are sometimes reported in other jurisdictions. We believe that Parliament needs comprehensive and consolidated information about tax-based expenditures to better understand total government spending.
Canada did a good job of analyzing new tax measures before they were implemented. For the measures we selected, the Department considered most key elements of its analytical framework, such as the need for government intervention and efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. Analysis on potential tax measures are prepared to support decision-making. We found that although the Department of Finance Canada monitored existing tax-based expenditures, it did not systematically evaluate those expenditures to determine whether they achieved the expected results and whether they were performing as intended. The policy requirement to evaluate direct program spending does not apply to tax-based expenditures. Also, tax expenditures are not included in comprehensive spending reviews such as strategic reviews. We found examples where the Department of Finance Canada identified issues in relation to certain tax measures before implementing them. Despite those issues, the Department had yet to evaluate these tax measures after they were implemented. When the Department evaluated tax measures, it did not publish the evaluations. For example, although the Department evaluated the Children's Fitness Tax Credit, it did not make the information public. We believe that information needs to be disclosed for parliamentarians to understand what the money spent through the tax system is accomplishing. Nous avons aussi examiné la...
We also examined the monitoring of costs and the sharing of information. We found that the Canada Revenue Agency monitored costs to implement new measures and compliance issues. It also shared relevant information with the Department of Finance Canada on an ongoing basis. The Department of Finance Canada has prepared a detailed action plan to address each of our recommendations. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my opening remarks. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Auditor General. And now over to Department of Finance, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Mr. Marsland. I would offer you the floor and ask you to introduce your delegation and give us your opening remarks, sir. You now have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. I'm joined here today by Mr. Jeff Truman, who's the General Director in the Tax Policy Branch, Maud Lavoie, who is Director of Intergovernmental Policy and Evaluation Research, and Miodrag Jovanovic, who is the Director of the Personal Income Tax Division. I'll begin my remarks today with a brief overview of the role of the Tax Policy Branch. I'll then say a few words about the Department of Finance's reporting on tax expenditures and the steps we're taking to address the recent recommendations by the Auditor General to improve our reporting on tax expenditures. The main responsibility of the Department of Finance with respect to taxation is to support the government in the development of federal tax policy. For the Tax Policy Branch, this involves developing, analysing and evaluating potential tax measures or adjustments to existing measures. It also involves drafting legislation and supporting its passage through Parliament. Our analysis is guided by sound tax policy principles in line with the objectives of ensuring a competitive, efficient, fair and simple tax system. The analysis, review and evaluation of either new or existing measures are carried out by highly qualified Finance Canada employees with in-depth knowledge of the Canadian tax system. The branch's analytical and evaluation work is systematic and thorough. Our analytical framework incorporates several elements. These elements include, for example, a detailed assessment of the need for policy intervention, an assessment of the effectiveness of a measure in meeting its policy objectives, whether measures meet fundamental policy objectives of efficiency, fairness and simplicity, consideration of alternative delivery mechanisms, a review of gender or environmental concerns as well as potential provincial or territorial impacts, an assessment of potential fiscal implications. We also consider administrative compliance and legislative concerns, and we consult other departments, stakeholders and other jurisdictions. Une fois les mesures adoptées, le ministère surveille.
When issues are identified, they are carefully reviewed by the department, and decision makers are briefed when appropriate. After a measure is implemented, the department monitors the performance of the tax system on an ongoing basis, meets stakeholders, analyzes trends and relevant data, monitors jurisprudence, and consults the Canada Revenue Agency, other than departments, agencies, and the general public. Although it may differ in some respects from the rules applicable to direct program spending, the review process for tax expenditures is effective in identifying potential issues with the tax system. It is also effective in leading us to the desired outcome, which is to ensure that the tax system performs as intended. Allow me to give you a few statistics that illustrate the scope and breadth of the branch's work. In the course of the last 4 federal budget exercises, the branch prepared detailed analyses of about 400 different tax proposals, and about 110 of these measures were either implemented or on course of being implemented. The department prepared 1,274 pages of new tax legislation in 2013 and 363 pages in 2014. Since 2006, more than one-third of all existing income tax expenditures were either adopted or modified to some extent.
The Department's reporting on tax expenditures. The Department first reported on federal tax expenditures in 1979 and was one of the first countries to do so. Since then, the Department has been proactive in providing extensive information on tax expenditures to Canadians in a manner that contributes to transparency and accountability. Through its annual Tax Expenditures and Evaluations Report and its companion reference document, Tax Expenditures, Notes to the Estimates, Projections, the Department provides valuable information to the public. This includes information on the objectives and design of federal tax expenditures, as well as their actual and projected costs. Canada is also one of a handful of countries that publish evaluations of tax expenditures on a regular basis. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and the International Monetary Fund have recognized the high quality of Canada's reporting on tax expenditures. We're pleased with the Auditor General's finding that the Department does a good job of analysing new tax measures and monitoring existing ones. And while the Department is of the view that we have a robust approach to the management of tax expenditures, we recognise there is always room for improvement. And it's in this spirit that we welcome the Auditor General's recommendations. Starting next year, the Department will be providing 2 additional years of information as recommended by the Auditor General. Also, as recommended, the Department will add information in the companion reference document to better inform readers on government spending programs. The Department is committed to continuously improving the public information available on tax expenditures and will make sure that high-quality analyses and evaluations of tax expenditures continue to be performed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Thank you. And now over to Canada Revenue Agency and the Director General of the Legislative Policy Directorate, Mr. Dimitrakopoulos. Sir, you now have the floor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Je vous remercie de l'invitation à témoigner devant.
I thank you for the invitation to appear before you today.
CRA's work with the Department of Finance on tax-based expenditures, as examined in the Auditor General's report released on April 28, 2015. The CRA is pleased to note that there were no points of concern raised by the Auditor General with our administration of tax-based expenditures, and no recommendations specific to the Canada Revenue Agency. By way of background, the Canada Revenue Agency is responsible for administering Canada's tax laws, including the Income Tax Act and the Excise Tax Act. We undertake a wide range of activities to assess and process tax returns, information returns, and payments for individuals and businesses. Additionally, we are also responsible for ensuring compliance with tax laws, which we do through a variety of means, including risk assessment, third-party data matching, verification, and audits. The Canada Revenue Agency works with the Tax Policy Branch within the Department of Finance to provide administrative considerations on tax changes in 2 ways. First, when the legislation is being developed, we provide analysis around administrative, compliance, enforceability, and costing matters. Second, once legislation has been implemented, we assess on an ongoing basis the administration of tax measures in order to identify any unforeseen consequences or issues in the practical application of the legislative measure. An ongoing dialogue helps ensure that the Department of Finance is in a position to fully consider potential compliance issues and implementation costs of tax-based expenditures. To support this, the Canada Revenue Agency examines a number of operational aspects, including impacts on our internal operations, provincial or territorial tax administrations, and, where possible, the number of taxpayers affected. In addition to the information provided to support Department of Finance analysis, the Canada Revenue Agency's analysis also allows us to identify issues important to our effective administration of the tax change, including changes to our information technology systems, the expected number of inquiries the change will generate, and necessary changes to our publications. After tax measures have been implemented, the Canada Revenue Agency provides the Department of Finance with further comments and analysis on issues such as compliance or additional costs related to the tax measure. In closing, I would like to reiterate that the Canada Revenue Agency works closely with the Department of Finance to assess the administrative aspects of new tax-based expenditures, and I'm happy to take questions on this process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Thank you. And now to begin our rotation of questions and comments, we'll begin with Mr. Falk. You, sir, now have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Auditor General, and also all the officials for joining us at committee here today. Always enjoy reading your reports. Mr. Ferguson, I'd like to start off with questions for yourself, and I'd like to say first off that our government is very pleased that the Auditor General concluded that our government has appropriate practices to analyze proposed tax expenditures, monitor existing ones, and share information with Canada Revenue Agency. In your report, you stated that Finance Canada does a good job of analyzing new tax measures and monitoring existing ones. Can you elaborate on your findings and how the government is providing transparency and accountability?
We were looking in the audit at a couple of different aspects. We were looking at what the Department of Finance does before a tax measure is put in place, and then we were also looking at what they do once a tax measure has been implemented. In terms of what they do before a tax measure is put in place, we cover that sort of starting in paragraph 34, which is where we say that when analyzing tax-based expenditures before they were implemented, the Department of Finance Canada considered most key elements of its analytical framework, such as a need for government intervention and efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. So throughout that section, we do say, for example, in 42, we found that the department analyzed the issues related to policy need, efficiency, effectiveness, equity, and foregone revenues for most of the selected tax measures. However, the department did not consider spending alternatives for the tax measures we examined. So overall, in the area of looking at a measure before it's implemented, we felt that the department was doing a good job of analyzing them and doing most of the things that were in their framework. We did say in paragraph 42, however, that we found in some cases that they hadn't considered spending alternatives for the tax measures that we examined.
Okay. And that would be after implementation?
No, this is all part of the pre-implementation. So, in paragraph 42, we say analyze the issues related to policy need, efficiency, effectiveness, so all of those considerations before the measure is implemented. However, one thing that they were not always considering was whether a spending alternative would be an option instead of the tax measure itself.
Okay, good. Thank you. The OECD has called Canada's tax measurement methodology as very thoroughly documented, and that Canada's approach to tax expenditures evaluation has an apparently successful track record of publication of reviews in some details. The OECD called these reviews impressive research products. In comparison to other countries, how does Canada fare when it comes to reporting tax expenditures?
The only reference we made in terms of comparing to other jurisdictions would be in paragraph 3.29. And this is in terms of the type of information that is made public by other jurisdictions. And in paragraph 29, we referred to Australia, France, and Pennsylvania, and the types of things that they include. For example, a short description of the tax measure, a discussion of its purpose or objective, the future cost of each tax expenditure, the number of beneficiaries, the administrative costs, and the reliability of the estimation method, as well as references to direct spending programs. So I think if you look at Finance Canada's report on tax expenditures, you will see that there is a lot of information contained in there. However, when we compared it to reports that were produced in other jurisdictions, we felt that there was room for Finance Canada to improve its reporting on its tax expenditures.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Marsland, could you elaborate a little bit on other jurisdictions, how they provide their cost projections and direct program spending like Canada does?
Sure. I think I guess I'd begin by saying that every country makes its own choices with respect to this. And some countries provide additional data that Canada does not provide at the moment. And some don't provide some of the data that Canada provides. So I think there's a variety of approaches, but I think the starting point has to be really how you define a tax expenditure. And the important thing that I think from Canada's perspective is essentially a tax expenditure is a deviation from the benchmark tax system. So how you define the benchmark tax system is very important in terms of defining the scope of expenditures on which you report. We take a very broad approach in Canada, which means we report on a very wide selection of tax expenditures, and I think the OECD in particular has noted that the breadth of the number of tax expenditures on which we report. I think it's fair to say that there are examples in other countries or the jurisdictions of data points that are provided, for example, more projections of revenues, but none of the jurisdictions provide all of those. If you see what I'm saying, they make particular choices. We welcome the Auditor General's recommendation to provide more cost projections, and we've committed to provide additional 2 years where appropriate. I think the challenge in that respect is often how do you the I guess ability to project forward on tax expenditures. Some tax expenditures are related to, for example, business cycles or the market, and it's quite difficult and in terms could be misleading to provide too long of a projection of costs going forward.
Okay.
But we will try and provide as much as possible.
Very good. Thank you. Time has expired. Thank you. We'll now move over to Mr. Allen. You now have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our guests. Mr. Marsland, maybe I'll just start with you. At 3.42, the Auditor General just actually walked us through that about a number of things at 3.41 and 4.2. It seems that 4.1 sort of lines up with your opening statement on page 2, detailed assessment effectiveness. It seems the points in 3.41 sort of mirror yours, except in 3.42, he says the department didn't consider spending alternatives for the tax measures that they examined, albeit they took a look at some, not all. And can you tell me why you wouldn't have looked at other alternatives beyond just the tax expenditure?
I guess what I can say is that part of our analytical framework is to look at alternatives to tax expenditures where appropriate. There are cases where it would not be appropriate, for example, where a tax expenditure relates to the accurate measurement of income for tax purposes, then quite clearly a direct spending program would not apply there. I can't really comment on the specific gaps there because I'm not really aware of what those gaps are, but what I can say is that as a matter of practice, our analytical framework does.
And I understand that, but I'm looking at the specific ones that the Auditor General looked at. So basically, it's either you do know or you don't know. And they didn't. So either if you don't know, that's fair because it's a pretty specific question, and I don't expect you, Mr. Marsland, to have every document in front of you. I appreciate the fact that you may not know exactly why it didn't happen, but you may want to actually tell the committee at some point in the future why it didn't. And there may well be fit inside those parameters. That's fair. The other part is the Auditor General's talked about did not systematically evaluate the expenditure to determine whether they achieved and expected results and whether they were performing as intended. So, and that was at point 7 of the Auditor General's opening remarks. So I look at page 2 of your opening remarks, sir. It says, after a measure is implemented, the department monitors the performance of the tax system on an ongoing basis. Now, tax system is very broad, I understand. But he said you didn't evaluate a certain number of these programs, and you seem to be alluding to in point 2 that you do. So was this just a question of oversight, or was this a question of, well, we're getting to this one,
or what exactly happened? Because the Auditor General was clear, you didn't. You're suggesting you do. So it kind of would be helpful to know whether, obviously it didn't get done because you're not refuting it. The issue is, why wasn't it done if that was your intention? Because you said here you do it. And if you didn't do it, as the Auditor General said, then why didn't you?
Yep.
And sir, when I say you, I don't mean you personally, of course.
Understood. So I believe the Auditor General selected 8 measures, 8 tax-based expenditures, and concluded that we evaluated 4 of them and didn't evaluate the other 4. I guess our position is that in effect, we did evaluate 7 of those measures, and we provided information in relation to those measures in terms of how we did. I think where we differ is whether or not there's a single document that evaluates that, as opposed to did we look at all of the components over a period of time that would go into an evaluation. So I believe the measures that the report indicated we didn't evaluate were the mineral exploration tax credit for flow-through shares. We provided documents, and again, I stress not a single document saying evaluation, but documents that went to an evaluation, including an evaluation we published on flow-through shares, which explicitly accounted for the mineral expenses tax credit. The 2 measures are kind of very closely related in that the mineral expense exploration tax credit builds on the flow-through share regime, and that evaluation dealt with that.
Okay, I'm going to run out of time. It's like this community. The taskmaster over here has got a big gavel. And so I hate to cut you off. In fact, I hate to cut anybody off. But the bottom line is it is time limited around here. I get all that. I appreciate that. So you're saying it's other places. The other point that the Auditor General makes is in reporting to Parliament. Because at the end of the day, you folks work extremely hard in the department to try to figure these things out that's requested of you. We actually have to approve them or not. So if we actually don't know what we've approved, because we don't really understand the long-term implications necessarily, because there's no reporting back to us in any, actually official way, in the sense of there's a report. The Auditor General in his report is saying, well, there's no tabled report that talks about tax expenditures going forward. I know you agreed with that. Why wouldn't we have done it in the past?
This is in terms of projections of going forward, of the cost of these expenditures. Well, in fact, we used to do more projections, and we found some problems in terms of the data and methodology going forward. And as I alluded to earlier, sometimes it's difficult to kind of estimate with a degree of assurance what the cost is. What we commit to do is add another 2 years. There will be circumstances where it's just simply not possible, and we will explain in detail why it's not possible, or we'll explain the weaknesses in the projections going forward. As I say, some tax expenditures, it's...
Mr. Marsland, really, it's just about information coming.
Time has expired.
How good it is, right?
Thank you.
It's really
moving along, over to Mr. Albus. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just want to thank all of our witnesses here today for the work you do through your quite different roles. I'd like to actually go back to where Mr. Falk had kind of left off, Mr. Chair. Specifically talking about, the international community, how we rank up. Sometimes comparative analysis is helpful in pointing out the bigger picture, although I do understand Mr. Marsland's point that while some countries may have specific measures in place, maybe they have a much different comprehensive system compared to ours. So the Inter-American Center of Tax Administration actually described Canada's tax expenditure reports as containing, and I quote, the greatest possible amount of information. Now, given the information Canada already provides, would you say, Mr. Marsland, that we have an appropriate proactive process in place to analyze new tax expenditures and to monitor the existing ones?
Yes, as I said in my opening remarks, I think we have a robust approach in both respects. And we provide the information to Parliament and the public through the tax expenditures report. Having said that, we welcome the Auditor General's recommendations in terms of improving that information going forward.
Do all jurisdictions provide cost projections and direct program spending like Canada does?
Yes, most OECD countries have publications that are similar to ours.
Okay. So the IMF has reported that countries typically report estimates only for 1 year. So currently, I believe we report for 2 years. Is that correct?
Our report has 6 years of data, so 4 years of historical estimates and 2 years of projections.
Okay. All right. I appreciate that. Now, in regards to the actual report, this is my question for the Auditor General. With regards to sections 3.34, when you looked at, for example, the children's fitness tax credit, for example, what did you find specifically to determine that the government had properly analyzed it? How did you arrive at your conclusion, Auditor General?
Well, I think as we explained in that whole section starting at 3.34 and so on, we talked about whether the department considered the key elements that we had identified. So I think in paragraph 40, we talk about their analytical framework and the various types of things that they would consider when they're doing an analysis before the implementation of an item. So the ones that we selected in particular that we were interested in were policy need or relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, equity, spending alternatives, and foregone revenue. So we wanted to see whether they were examining those before recommending the implementation of a measure. And as we say in 42, we found that they had done most of those, the one exception being the consideration of spending alternatives for the tax measures that we examined.
So going back to finance, how does the department analyze tax-based expenditures that you've implemented to ensure that they're helpful to Canadians?
I believe that takes a number of different strands in terms. So in terms of the tax expenditures report, every year we recost every single expenditure, and that allows us to see if there are kind of divergences from what we'd expect, and then look at that. So that's a monitoring approach. We also continually look at there are continually proposals that come from various quarters to change tax expenditures. So when we look at an adjustment to a tax expenditure, we effectively treat it as a new proposal. We take that opportunity to apply the analytical framework the Auditor General referred to the whole measure with the benefit of some data in that case. We also select particular tax expenditures for an in-depth evaluation. So this year we published an evaluation of the charitable donations tax credit. Probably the reasons that went into selecting that is there's a wide interest in that measure, of course, throughout the voluntary sector. It's an expensive tax measure if you calculate it in tax expenditure terms. And it's one that we believe is particularly important. So we did an evaluation on that and published it. So I'd say there's a wide range of approaches. I think the Auditor General's observation that there's required to be systematic about it, we take that to heart, and we're going to look at ensuring that across all of those approaches we're covering all the bases, and whether, if to the extent there are gaps, we will make sure they're filled.
Good. Time's expired, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Albus. Over now to Monsieur Giguère. You have the floor, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for having come today. Now, on page 1 of the report, there's something very important that talks about the deferrals and tax exemptions, deductions, and credit. And so all of this, if we look at the full report for expenses and the assessment of 2013 on flow-through shares is very clear. And I've analyzed this document, and particularly on page 51, you indicate that the $1.4 billion generated by these activities benefits mainly people who have a high income that invest in flow-through shares. So I mean by that the bulk of that measure, we're not telling us whether that $1.4 billion could be funded other than through these flow-through shares. your report doesn't address that, but the problem that you do talk about is that it's mainly wealthy people who benefit from this particular tax deduction. And so I'm wondering, insofar as tax measures are have as a goal to reduce the wealth gap, this seems to be the opposite. And this is also being observed on page 1 of the Parliamentary Budget Officer's document that says that this inequity and inegalities have changed little over time, with an increase in inequalities and the creation of tax measures and transfers. And so since 1980, with a change particularly between 1991 and 2000, is that these inequalities only seem to be growing. So why are you not doing something to prevent that situation from happening rather than intervening to accentuate it?
I think I'd respond by saying that when we analyze particular tax measures, and you referred to one in terms of our work on flow-through shares and the mineral expense tax credit, we apply a whole range of considerations. So firstly, what's the policy objective of the measure? What's the policy gap? In that case, the objective of the measures overall, stated broadly, is to encourage investment in the junior mining sector. So we look at that policy objective there. We look at the efficiency of the measure, its effectiveness in achieving its objective. We look at the equity issues, both horizontal and vertical equity issues, and how that applies. We look at the complexity, simplicity, and so on. So we apply a whole range of those. They're all important in terms of looking at individual tax measures. I think the second part of your question went to the overall distribution of the tax system, and I guess the equity considerations are important there when you're looking at particular measures.
À ce moment-là, si l'objectif...
Well, at that point in time, if the objective is so important, explain to me why the system for studies, for savings for studies, which is supposed to help students to go to university, it is assessed as being a complete failure. It doesn't help kids to get to university, that the people that benefit from that benefit from it, and yet that measure is still brought back from year after year, where the objective is excluded now as it's being a means to get more students into universities. It just seems to be a tax avoidance measure. So if the objective is not at all being met according to your own objectives, why do you keep a measure that accentuates inequities, tax inequities once again?
You got my name?
Somebody answer, please.
Yes. Well, I would say part of your question obviously referred to a policy decision that the government has made, and I can't tell you much about the results of the study you're pointing to. I mean, just a second. And yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm not clear specifically which measure you're referring to, but there are a suite of measures that touch upon education in the Income Tax Act, one of which was covered by the audit, the textbook tax credit. There's an education credit.
No. You may finish, and then we're done. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
The point appeared to be that these measures are not meeting the policy objective. I think our view would be that they are meeting the policy objective. In terms of supporting education. They're designed in a way that facilitate the claiming by the student. If the student has income, the transfer to a supporting person if the student doesn't have income. or carry forward to future years. They provide important support to assist students, but they're part of a suite of federal programs. And when we look at the operation of these tax credits, we look at them in concert with the other programs, such as the Canada Student Loans Program.
Okay, Mr. Zaguer, you're on the list, so you'll get a second chance if you want to pick up where you left off, but time has expired. Okay. We need to move along now to Vice Chair Carmichael, who now has the floor.
Well, thank you, Chair. I'd like to start, if I could, with Madame Lavoie. With regards to your answer to my colleague, Mr. Albus, you talked about the historical record keeping that's posted on your website. I believe 6 years historical. What did you have? 6 years, 1 year, and 2 years? Is that correct?
So our report presents 6 years in total of data on tax expenditure every year. 4 of those are historical estimates, and 2 years are projections. So,
sorry, four historical.
Yes.
Thank you. As I read through the report, and we look at the 2 years of projected. Mr. Marsland, I wonder if you could talk to the benefit of the additional 2 years now. Talk about, if you would, and then I'd ask maybe Mr. Ferguson to offer his opinion as well.
I would suggest that the benefit would be to allow the objective of providing those measures will be to allow a better sense of how the tax expenditure will grow in importance over the few years. I think you can do that in many tax expenditures by looking at the 4 years of historical data and the 2 years projections, but I guess an additional 2 years would allow you a little more in terms of understanding how that's growing. Some tax expenditures would follow broadly the growth in the economy or the growth in employment income, for example, and which is relatively predictable. I wouldn't say it's completely predictable. Others may have a higher degree of volatility, and it is in those cases where we're more cautious about projecting out. We don't have a crystal ball, and we can't tell how the markets are going to perform over the next 2 years, and what the business cycle is going to be with a degree of accuracy. So, I think in answer to your question, it would allow in some cases a better sense of the trend in the expenditure. In other cases, we would be cautious about, we would certainly want to caveat those additional 2 years to make sure that we didn't mislead people.
So there is value in adding these extra 2 years?
I think there's always value in information. I think, as I say, if I sound cautious, it's because we wouldn't want to kind of give a false degree of assurance as to what those expenditures will be in particular cases where there's more volatility expected.
Mr. Ferguson, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. My understanding, if you look at the tax expenditures and evaluation report, is yes, it contains 4 years of actual. So, for example, if you look at the 2014 report, the 4 years of actuals go up to 2012. The projections are 2013 and 2014. So what they really represent is the fact that the final numbers are not known for 2013 and 2014 at the point in time that the 2014 report is prepared. They are not providing projections into the future, which would be what you would see, for example, in a report on plans and priorities of a department. You know, what is that department expecting to spend a couple of years into the future? So I think in sort of this conversation about projections and providing projections, I think we've got two different definitions of projections happening. And what we're talking about essentially is the same type of information. And in spending programs, there's lots of lack of precision in those estimates going forward as well. But in spending programs, it's possible to provide those projections beyond the year in question. And so we're saying because a number of these programs are similar to spending programs, that type of projection information would be useful for the reader to understand what the costs of these tax expenditures are going to be into the future.
So the additional 2 years then is strictly future planning, future projections?
It would be estimates of what those tax-based expenditures would, the value of them, what that would be, 2 years into the future.
As we review this type of information and data, I heard one comment, and I think it was Mr. Marsland, who mentioned that the cost expenditures are reviewed every year and updated within the tables. Does that mean then the previous 2 years, as that information comes available, is updated annually?
Yes, and we publish the tax expenditure report in line with the tabling of the main estimates every year. And in preparation for that, we use the latest available data, which will vary from measure to measure, whether it's a corporate measure or a GST measure. The data sources are different. We use the most up-to-date information to revise the numbers and look forward. So and as I say, that's an important part of the monitoring of these tax expenditures.
Thank you. No, sorry, time's expired. Moving along, over now to Mr. Woodworth. You, sir, now have the floor. Sorry? Oh, my mistake. My apologies. Like you don't get enough spots and I run right over you. My apologies, Mr. Vaughn. You, sir, now have the floor.
Thank you very much. A couple of questions. The child tax credit, the decision not to make public its benefit in terms of how it's quantified, why wouldn't that happen as of just sort of a regular practice? Why would it have to be mandated to occur?
So the document referred to was an internal policy development paper that we prepared in looking at evolving the policy. So it wasn't a document that we prepared for public release.
But why wouldn't that be released as part of a public process to understand exactly the impact that the tax is having? Why wouldn't that be part and parcel with the launch of a new tax like that?
Well, as I say, it was prepared for an internal purpose in terms of the policy development and the changes in the consideration at the time. Okay. So.
And when you say that you don't consider the spending alternatives, when in some of these taxes that they're looked at as the tax credit, just as a tax credit, but you don't examine what the alternatives would be as an expenditure. Unpack that for me. Why is the alternative not asked for, and why is the alternative not presented as part of a proposal moving forward?
I think I said that part of our analytical framework. So we have a kind of template we use when we look at any tax measure, and part of that is looking at spending alternatives, alternative delivery mechanisms. I think there are exceptions where we don't go much further than looking at it and saying, well, there isn't an exception. So if it's a measure that's really goes to the measurement, for example, of employment income, you're trying to get at what's the person's real employment income. So you're recognizing tradesmen's tools, for example, that they're required to spend on those. It's not really practical to envisage a spending alternative for that at the federal level, so we probably don't go to a great lengths to analyze it, but we certainly kind of consider it's a question we ask in every case.
Okay, and on the first-time home buyers tax credit on 3.60, the report says for the first-time home buyers tax credit, we found the department identified some risks regarding this tax credit that the government introduced to stimulate housing demand, but that we found the department did not evaluate these two tax credits a year after their implementation. Why, if there were risks, why wouldn't you evaluate the years after, and why wouldn't you report out as to whether or not those risks were mitigated or whether they came to fruition?
Well, I'm not aware of the specific risks referred to in the report, but I guess what I would say as a general statement before I come back to the specific is that I don't think there's any case when looking at a tax measure, in my experience, where there aren't risks. There are always risks of whether they be compliance risks that are anticipation of the reaction of taxpayers will be different. The reality will be different than our anticipation. There are always risks. And I guess our role is to identify those risks, analyze them, and mitigate them, or provide ways of mitigating them. We did monitor the first-time home buyers credit. We reported out on that. The government reported out on that in its reports on the Economic Action Plan, and we continue to monitor that in the context of developments in the housing market. But we did not do a single evaluation on that measure.
Even though you identified it as a potential problem?
I have to say, I don't know what the specific risks identified, but there are always risks and issues with tax measures given their
so would that mean
nature.
the tax credit isn't indexed. It's stayed the same level since its introduction. Does that mean that you haven't, for example, evaluated whether or not flatlining it has actually led to a decline in it being employed, or it's a usefulness, or whether it's no longer stimulating first-time buyers to enter the market? Is that assessment not being done or is being done?
Well, we do a lot of work in the context of budgets, which I can't really kind of talk to. So we do look at these issues kind of continually. But I can't tell you whether we've evaluated specifically the threshold and whether we've thought about increasing it.
So I guess what I'm concerned about is that you say that you identify risk, you don't do the follow-up to identify whether that risk has been mitigated or not, and you don't necessarily disclose whether the risk is being breached. So how are we to assess whether or not the due diligence is being done if you don't give us the due diligence as a report?
I guess what I was saying is when we analyze a measure, when we look at changes in the measure, we look at the risks associated with that, and we provide advice in relation to that.
Yes.
Advice.
But you don't table that advice. That advice is provided to the minister.
To the minister, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Time has expired. I believe, and I'll leave myself open to be corrected again, but I do believe, Mr. Woodworth, it is your turn to have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for attending today. I'd like to begin, at least, with some questions to you, Mr. Marsland, and specifically about the issue of evaluation. And I'd like to begin with confirming whether I heard correctly in your remarks that at some point that it is your view that the department did evaluate 7 of the 8 programs that the Auditor General looked at. Did I hear that correctly?
You did.
All right. And may I ask which one of the 8 do you feel that the department did not evaluate?
The one I referred to, the first-time homebuyers tax credit.
Homebuyers tax. Thank you. I must have just missed that. And the Auditor General makes the point that there is a distinction between monitoring and evaluation. So I want to be clear about whether or not when you tell us that the department did evaluate 7 of those 8 programs, you do mean evaluate, not simply monitor.
I do, yes.
All right. And by that, I take you to mean that from your opening remarks, that your monitoring does in fact result in identifying potential issues with the tax system and also ensures that the tax system performs as intended. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. I want to be certain about whether there's any issue about wording here. I would have preferred you to say that the monitoring does identify potential issues with any particular tax expenditure, or does in fact ensure that every particular tax expenditure performs as intended. Is that what you mean? Or are you just talking about the tax system generally?
I'm not sure. I mean, the tax system is a collection of those individual measures,
Yeah.
So we're looking at those individual measures.
Let me ask it more specifically then. When you monitored the mineral exploration tax credit and when you evaluated the mineral exploration tax credit, did your evaluation lead you to conclusion about whether that program was performing as intended?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Thank you. And what I gather from your action plan then is that while you are telling us, and it's your evidence, that in fact you are monitoring and evaluating tax expenditure programs, it may be that you could improve in how that monitoring is formalized and documented. Is that correct?
I think what we're saying is is that we will undertake to. Our view is that we effectively evaluate tax measures, that we monitor appropriately, and so on. But we accept that we need to be able to demonstrate that both to others and to ourselves.
Right.
So we will systematically look at what our work and make sure there are no gaps, and to the extent there are gaps, we will make sure they're filled.
And this is actually a very excellent function that the Auditor General's Office provides, in that it's not infrequent that departments are doing things and just not able to document them in a way which demonstrates that they're doing them. And so I understand that's the point of your evidence on this. And I also understand that this process design will be completed by the summer of this year and implemented during the fall of this year. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
It seems kind of an ambitious timetable to me. Are you pretty certain that it will be accomplished?
We've committed to do that, and we will do it.
So you'll burn the midnight oil. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do I have time left? The chair is busy, so that means I've got time left. I'd like to know a little bit. I understand that you can cherry pick particular issues on which to report or not report. Cherry pick is my word, by the way, and that some things we decide to report, some we don't. But overall, what does, for example, the IMF or the OECD say about our reporting, Canadian reporting on tax expenditures as compared to reporting of tax expenditures elsewhere in the world, in an overall basis?
Well, as Mr. Marsland alluded to earlier, the OECD frequently notes that we're providing information on a very wide range of tax expenditures. It is seen as being very transparent that we list not only information on the types of tax expenditures that were part of this chapter, but on a lot of other tax measures. The way that we document the methodology has been noted by the OECD. The number of years for which we provide projections has been noted by the IMF. And the fact that we do publish some evaluation has also been noted as something important by the OECD, because not many countries do so.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We're done. By the way, you had 20 seconds when you asked. Moving along now, over to Mr. Allen. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Marsland, I was sort of distracted, so I wanted to just be sure. You talked about the 8 that were looked at, and you said 7, in your view, were evaluated or things were done to them. The one that was missing, was that the home tax credit, first-time home buyer's tax credit? Was that the one you said wasn't of the 8?
That's correct. Okay. But we did provide evidence and monitoring. That's
okay. Mr. Ferguson, when you looked at that, and I believe in your report you talk about the issue of it not being done, can you tell us what you found from that and why you thought it was important that it should have been done?
Well, what we were looking at was whether after implementation of these tax measures, whether there was monitoring and evaluation done. And we have defined in paragraph 55 what we mean by monitoring, and in paragraph 56 what we mean by evaluation. The reason that we felt that it was important to consider the evaluation aspect was because that type of evaluation is what is done for direct program spending. And there's a Treasury Board policy on direct program spending around evaluation. So we felt that that type of evaluation work would be important when you're dealing with a tax measure that could be a substitute for direct spending. I think, certainly we have identified that finance has done a good job with the monitoring. We felt that, only 4 of the 8 cases did we feel that they had covered off everything that we would expect them to cover off in terms of being able to say that it was evaluated. Certainly we have agreed that they have done monitoring of them, but not to the full extent of what an evaluation would cover.
And so when in 3.60, Mr. Ferguson, note at the tail end of that paragraph, which is actually on page 15 of the English, it says first-time home buyers tax credit and a textbook tax credit, which was one of the ones you flagged as the department had said there was potential risks at the outset. The department does not have complete information to determine if these tax measures are relevant and performing as intended, was quote-unquote is in your report. So from your perspective, is that a weakness in how the system operated? Is this a systemic thing? Is it an issue of, well, they monitor, but they don't really evaluate? I mean, it's like counting things, you know. There's this month so many went past, and last month so many went past, but I didn't bother to evaluate what went past. It just went past, just a number, which really I find quite striking, to be truthful. I know it's taxes and we count taxes, but this is actually not counting money. It's actually money we're not getting because we're letting it go somewhere else. So it just strikes me, sir, that, you know, at the end, that tail end of that program, which brings me to Exhibit 3.3 on page 12 of the English, and I believe you touched on it. It talks about direct program spending, tax-based expenditures. It actually says under evaluation, direct program spending is required, tax-based expenditures not required. Subject to expenditure reviews, direct programming is yes, tax-based expenditures no. Does that seem appropriate to you? Do you think we should actually evaluate it? Should we then have a policy that says thou shalt evaluate rather than a policy that presently says you don't have to if you don't want to? You may, but you don't have to.
Well, the recommendation we made in paragraph 61 was that the Department of Finance Canada should conduct systematic and ongoing prioritized evaluations of all tax-based expenditures, similar to what all departments and agencies are required to do for direct program spending, and then what it should include. I think the fact that in paragraph 60 we talk about the fact that, you know, there were some risks identified in these programs or in these tax measures speaks to the importance of doing later evaluations once they have been implemented, and understanding that all tax measures, all of these tax-based expenditures have risks associated with them, but all government programs have risks associated with them. And I think the fact that programs have risks associated with them, whether they're tax-based expenditures or direct spending programs, is exactly the reason why there needs to be systematic evaluations covering all aspects of the evaluations, and that's why we made that specific recommendation in paragraph 61.
Okay, sorry, time's expired. Over back to Mr. Albus, who now has the floor again. Sir.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd like to ask my question to the official today. So, regarding section 3.64, obviously we've been talking about the importance of monitoring, but can you just say how important it is to monitor new the implementation of new measures? Pardon. Hopefully I'm in stereo this time. So my question is CRA. Specifically, when we're talking about implementation of a new tax expenditure, can you just talk about the monitoring and how that is important? I would imagine that, just like any new measure, you know, there's going to be certain documentation that would be required. I guess CRA may or may not may see certain patterns when taxpayers are filing for certain tax credits, whether or not they have the proper documentation. Can you just explain the importance of monitoring that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, when we're looking at new measures, we're looking at them and monitoring them in the sense of looking at how it affects the enforceability, the compliance aspects of it, and as well as how does it affect our internal operations. We're also looking at whether there's an impact in terms of the size of the measure in terms of how many taxpayers are affected, which could impact with respect to the number of tax inquiries we may get on our phone lines, the number of objections or appeals, and it has an impact on verification.
That's something that there's a continuing conversation, I imagine, between finance and your department to ascertain these things and to share information.
Yes, Mr. Chair, there's an ongoing dialogue. When we see something that causes us concern, we have discussions at the officials level to make sure that the Department of Finance is kept fully apprised.
Okay. To the Auditor General, when we look at implementing a new tax measure, that obviously can affect the tax system's complexity. So it's important, I think, that CRA and the finance communicate when they consider implementing a new tax measure. Can you just tell us a little bit about your finding in Section 3.64 of your report?
Well, we did indicate that CRA monitors the cost to implement the new measures, and that it monitors the compliance issues and shares that relevant information with the Department of Finance on an ongoing basis. I think we say further on, for example, in paragraph 73, that according to the agency, adding one line to the T1 tax return related to a new non-refundable tax credit can involve significant effort and cost the agency up to $1 million. So they've done, they've done analysis of what the administrative impact and the administrative costs are, as well as the issues related to compliance.
Thank you. So now, again, we have obviously our tax code here, and we have other jurisdictions specific. I'd like just to ask, in the report, in the spring Auditor General report, it states that in some international jurisdictions they have adopted reporting practices where they provide short descriptions of a tax measure and a discussion of its purpose or objective and the future cost of each tax expenditure and the number of beneficiaries. So the Auditor General listed Australia, I guess, France, and Pennsylvania as examples. So do they all provide such information, or is it just a little bit? And can you tell us a few areas where Australia, France, and Pennsylvania may also be falling behind our approach?
Sure. Well, all these countries have very good tax expenditure publication and provide a lot of information. We all make different choices, in terms of what it is that we provide as information. Certainly in Canada, we do have descriptions of the objectives, of the description of the tax measures. We provide 6 years of data. We provide analytical products. In Australia, they have a lot of that, but they, for instance, would not provide information on the objectives. In France, they also do quite a very comprehensive report, but we could note that they don't have a description. So those are just examples that show that we all make different choices, but I do want to underscore that all those countries have very high quality publication as well. It's just that the choice in terms of what is presented differs across countries.
So it sounds to me there's a lot of monitoring that goes on. Both departments are constantly, checking to make sure that the integrity of the tax system is there. But for constituents of my area, Okanagan-Coquihalla, where would they go online to be able to view some of these tax expenditure reports? How could they find out the information themselves?
Well, the Department of Finance has 2 publications. So the one that we update annually is available on our website, and it provides every year 6 years of cost projection, and it also provides typically 2 analytical papers on topics of interest. Accompanying that is another document that's available on our website, and that provides more information on the methodology, on the objectives of each tax expenditure, provides a description of all those tax expenditure. That one is not updated every year. The last time it was updated was in 2010. But when there are changes to any of those measures, it's noted in the annual report. The CRA, I would add, also provides extensive information, statistical information on tax expenditures on the personal income tax side. And we could add, all the tax expenditures are noted there. You could have information by income level, by major source of income, by age, by sex. So there's a wide range of statistical information also available on the CRA's website.
Thank you very much.
On time. Appreciate it. Moving along, back over to Mr. Vaughn. Didn't run over you this time. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Back to the first-time home buyers. I guess the question to Mr. Ferguson. The report says that the department does not have complete information to determine if these tax measures are relevant and performing as intended. That surely has to raise some red flags as to whether or not the goals are being met, but not only that, whether or not you're tracking impact. If that has to be beyond just a significant concern. That has to be a worry, doesn't it?
Well, I think that we have specifically highlighted this in the report because we felt it was something that needed to be brought to Parliament's attention. The fact that these types of tax measures, which could be substituted by direct program spending, where there would be complete evaluations done on a periodic basis. That same type of evaluation rigor does not exist for these types of credits, and that's why we've made the recommendation in paragraph 61.
This particular credit was brought in 2009 when the housing market across North America was in extraordinary turmoil. The mortgage crisis had hit the United States, and there was a downturn in terms of the housing market in this country. A stimulus package was brought in, but how do you know how to evaluate whether that stimulus package is still needed? How do you know whether it's needed in certain parts of the country in different ways than in other parts of the country? If you're not evaluating that particular tax policy, it appears to be a tax cut for the sake of making it, well, not a tax cut, but a tax credit for the sake of making a tax credit, but you have no idea of how effective it is. And you're not monitoring its effectiveness, and you're not tracking how it's being used and whether it is in fact stimulating an uptake in first-time buyers that may be present with or without the measure.
I think sort of in your question, you're touching on something that we have dealt with as well in our recommendation in paragraph 33, where we say to adequately support parliamentary oversight, the Department of Finance Canada should adopt improving reporting practices for tax-based expenditures to provide additional information, including, and the first bullet point is, cross-references of tax expenditures to direct program spending so readers can understand total government spending. So it's important to do the evaluations of the tax measures, the tax-based expenditures, but I think that's also why it's important to make sure that when people see this type of a program, they can understand if there are other types of programs that would be linked to the tax measure. You're talking about an evaluation, I believe, as I understood your question, an evaluation that would go beyond the evaluation of just the individual tax measure, which we think is something that should be done and is part of our recommendation in paragraph 61, to an evaluation that would look at sort of the broader interaction of this tax measure with other measures, whether they be tax measures or direct program spending. And we would say that at least the first step in that is our other recommendation in paragraph 33 that helps the reader understand the linkage between a particular tax measure and direct program spending.
Because the concern would arise that you're moving on changing the tax code with the stated objective, but you never go back to check to see whether or not you've achieved what you started out to try to achieve. It's almost a tax cut for the sake of it, or a tax break for the sake of a tax break, without ever understanding whether or not it had an impact on the market the way you want it to have an impact. I mean, it's one thing to track the accounting rules and making sure that it's being used properly, but if it's brought in as a stimulus to respond to a particular crisis, surely you have to assess whether or not it had any impact on that crisis to know whether you should stop it or start it again next time the same conditions exist.
And I think sort of in the course of your question, you've let me touch on all three of our recommendations, because our other recommendation was about providing more information. So we've talked about the fact that there is information available, and it's information available on the website. But when the main estimates comes out, at the same time the main estimates comes out, the tax expenditure and evaluation report is prepared. The main estimates is tabled with Parliament, but the tax expenditure and evaluation report is not tabled with Parliament. Making sure that Parliament is aware of all of this information at the one time would be important to make sure that that it isn't forgotten. Again, because these types of expenditures are substitutes, because tax measures are substitutes for direct program spending, these tax-based expenditure measures. It's important that there be a way that Parliament is aware of, what they are, that they do exist, that information would be tabled, and that it contain the same type of information going forward, future year projections. And through that, that's the way that Parliament would make sure that the programs, they can still ask questions about the programs and that they still have relevance. And then in the department, from the department point of view, treating them similar to direct program spending and doing the same types of evaluations that would happen on direct program spending would make sure that there's consistency in the way those types of programs are being evaluated.
Okay, thank you. Time's expired. And once again, back over to Mr. Woodworth. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to just follow up on a few loose ends from my earlier questioning, and I'll begin again with you, Mr. Marsland. We didn't really have time to discuss what happened in relation to the evaluation of the first-time homebuyers tax credit. Could you tell me just a little bit about why that evaluation didn't occur, or has it now occurred, or what's the status of that?
So in relation to the first-time homebuyers tax credit, we, in the period in question, which I think is 2008-2014, we closely monitored the credit in the context of the department's broader monitoring of the housing market. We covered aspects such as the credit's relevance, its fiscal cost, possible compliance, and administrative issues. In terms of the reporting on that, we provided estimates of the stimulus value and the job impact in relation to the credit and other housing investment measures. Those were part of the government's reports on the Economic Action Plan, periodic reports on that. We also monitored, the department that is, monitored the evolution of real estate prices in Canada, and conducted studies to understand the determinants of price changes. And that, of course, involved monitoring the potential effects, desirable and undesirable, of the first-time homebuyers tax credit on the real estate market.
Is there any intent to tie all of that together in what might be described as an evaluation rather than merely monitoring?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the 8 measures where we don't think we evaluated it. But I think part of our response to the Auditor General's recommendation is to ensure that we have a system in place to ensure that we're covering off all the bases in terms of evaluating these measures.
Right. And you heard earlier the Auditor General's critique, I guess I will call it, about the evaluations, and there seemed to be what he was, I think, describing as gaps. Do you have anything further that you can add on that?
I think it rather goes to the issue of what's a tax expenditure. As I mentioned earlier, essentially how we define a tax expenditure is any deviation from a benchmark tax system. And we define our benchmark tax system as broad as possible, so we report on as many tax expenditures as possible, really. In that context, we capture a whole range of different measures that serve different purposes in the tax system. Some, as the Auditor General observes, are closer to substitutes to direct spending, but many are not. They go to the accurate measurement of income. They go to a simplicity. For example, we report as a tax expenditure the taxation of capital gains on realization as opposed to accrual. We do that for practical purposes because it would be extraordinarily complex to tax capital gains as they accrue before the property is sold. I say that to kind of point out that there's not a homogeneous nature to a tax expenditure. There's a vast range of measures. And I think in looking at them in terms of how you evaluate them, you need to kind of take that into account and look at the risks associated with them, the expenditures, whether or not they're really an integral part of the tax system, and the risks are perhaps not as high. You need to understand the cost of them and how they're performing, but look at them in slightly different lights.
Thank you. I'll go back to Madame Lavoie just for a moment. I tried to squeeze in a question about whether the IMF or the OECD at any point has ever said that Canada's reporting on tax expenditures is second to anyone else's, or in fact have they said the opposite, or has there been a comparative exercise or comment from them?
I'm not aware that the OECD or the IMF or other international organizations would have ranked countries. As I mentioned earlier, countries make different choices in terms of the information that they provide, and certainly some organizations have tried to develop guidelines and things like that, and they've noted that Canada is doing very well in certain respects, but I'm not aware of a specific ranking, if that's your question.
How about on the question of how frequently tax expenditure reports are published? Where does Canada stand relative to the rest of the world in that measure?
As far as I'm aware, many countries publish a similar report for providing cost estimates of their tax expenditures on an annual basis, but I'm not completely sure about this question. But as far as I know, most countries do that annually.
Very good. Thank you. Time's expired. And back over to Monsieur Giguère, who gets the floor again. Sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope I won't surprise you too much with my questions. I hope that you'll be able to answer them easily enough. On point 358, we say that the problem is, excuse me, an overall one. Professor Lauzon, I hope you know his works, talked about the wealthiest in a population don't have to pay any taxes at all, and at times these people don't even pay a small amount. So the whole issue is this comprehensive movement that you're bringing here to the Canadian tax system. Is it not going to result in us obliging our grandchildren to be paying for the tax breaks that we're giving people now? Because it's being observed that tax expenditures are constantly going up, and that these systematically favor the wealthiest Canadians, and we really don't want to see our grandchildren having to pay our bills. So as 358 says, there isn't a comprehensive assessment of this. Don't all not answer at the same time. I think that we certainly have concerns that everyone pay their fair share in the system, but insofar as high revenues are concerned, I should say that people who are in the uppermost bracket are paying 29%, and they represent 3% of the people in Canada, and they're paying 35% of the tax in this country. So I'd also like to add that every year the department does examine these issues closely to ensure that the system is fair, and in every budget we mention the list of what we call the integrity measures that have been created by the government. But we still have the same problem at this level, which is to say that the 3% you're talking about of the wealthiest Canadians, between the money that they are making and the actual taxes that they pay, the gap just keeps widening one. So these people are not paying taxes on their comprehensive wealth. So really, are they paying their fair share is the issue. You're saying they're paying in 29% in their tax bracket, but the problem is that very few pay 29% on their income. They just pay a fraction of their taxable income. If you look at the Carter's Commission, it seems that Canadians are not fairly taxed. Well, I think that's a much broader issue. That is to say, how Canada's tax system should be set up, and it's not just an issue of those kinds of gaps. Well, we need this information from time to time to be able to make a decision. See, income tax is going to help us to reduce this, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer talks about it. It's going to help us reduce these iniquities, and you're not able to tell us how to do so. How can we, as legislators, vote on these bills? We need this information. Well, I would just like to add a comment to say that tax expenditures are not systematically regressive. I don't think. I mean, they're the Whitby working income tax benefit definitely targets people with low incomes, and it's a measure that helps or attempts to fight against the welfare wall, as we call it. So, Mr. Chairman, you understand the problem here is if you're not able to answer my questions here, how can you hope that we, in terms of as legislators, identify what's unacceptable? And I'm making reference now to the initial statement made by Mr. Marshall, who said that there were 363 pages of new tax measures in 2014. So how can Canadians, I mean, the Income Tax Act is legally incredibly technical and complex, and the accountants in Miss Canada said that the document had become a thing that no one could find their way through anymore, and now you're accentuating that problem. You are increasing the volume of the Income Tax Act rather than simplifying it. And the best example of that is on page 17 of your report from 2013, the disability tax credit. Even today, many members have to inform disabled people that what the definition of a disabled person is and the rights that they would have under that. So it's all very nice to have a piece of legislation, and I agree with Mr. Albus on this. It has to be accessible to the great majority of Canadians. Canadians have to know that it's accessible, and they have to know how to access it, because it seems to me that and the bulk of the documents that are being presented to us and the report, it's the whole issue of accessibility to the benefits of the tax system.
So you got your question, but I'm afraid you're not going to get an answer. We're going to move along. Mr. Albus, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you to everyone that's been here today to offer your views on the Auditor General's report. Specifically, I'd just like to cap off with just a conversation around the action plan. Mr. Marsland, perhaps you or some of the other officials here today can just point out some of the steps that you will be taking in response to the Auditor General's report.
Sure. I'm happy to respond to that one, Mr. Allen. I think to recap some of the material that's already been covered today, in order to respond very directly to the comments in the Auditor General's report, we will be adding those 2 additional years of cost projections. So what that'll do, it'll give those 2 forward-looking years that move beyond the backward and the present, and we'll be able to have some forward projections for a couple of years, subject to any caveats that are necessary about the robustness of those estimates. We'll also undertake to provide additional information on government spending programs so that we can add that into the companion document, the somewhat more in-depth explanatory document that accompanies the tax expenditures, and we'll try to provide links to relevant programs so that when individuals do go to look at the tax expenditures, they'll be able to undertake a comprehensive approach. For example, if you look at information about the scientific research and experimental development tax credit, there could also be information then directing you to certain programs that are offered by Industry Canada that also target research and development. That would be an obvious one to add there. We've also certainly committed to the ongoing monitoring of tax expenditures and to undertake that in a more formalized, systematic process that will help to inform the breadth and depth of our analysis, and that where possible gaps are identified, we'll be able to move to address those gaps more quickly by undertaking relevant evaluation reports. And finally, I would just note that we certainly are committed to continuing to publish pertinent information. Over recent years, we've been able to publish at least 2 evaluations per year over the recent past, and we would certainly like to be able to continue to do that going forward, providing the kind of robust analysis and quality information and making that available to the public and parliamentarians.
Well, thank you, and Mr. Chair, I just would like to thank all of our witnesses here again today for their efforts. We all have different roles, but I do appreciate the service to your country, and my constituents, many of them really like the different tax credits that they are. I received phone calls last week asking about the new ones that are going to be installed, so I'm sure your methodology and your continued vigilance towards the integrity of our tax system while making sure that all Canadians have a high quality of life will be very helpful. Thank you again, Auditor General, for your work on this, and I have no further questions.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Zaguer, do you have an intervention?
Well, given that it's 5 and the committee is supposed to go until 5:30, we have the room until then, I'd like to ask a question, and I would like you to give, or the committee to give the permission of the witnesses to answer it as to the issue of the complexity of the legislation that just keeps getting more and more complex and over time, and the solutions that might be brought forward to deal with that.
The committee is interested in extending the discussion. We have completed the usual rotation through once, which are formal, and it's always up to the committee if they wish to continue or not. So, did you want to make a particular suggestion? Did you want to go for a whole half hour, one more each? What are you looking for? Quickly, please.
Well, I'll ask my colleagues if we can extend it. But I had asked a question, and because I took too much time in asking it.
Well, okay. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I want to be 100% clear. Wait. You're just asking for the time to hear the answer to the question you asked that you ran out of time to hear. Oh, wait. Let me test the floor.
If it's a minute, I don't think it's an issue.
Yeah, that's my sense of it, just to give a quick, okay, very good, that's fair. If somebody, just to retune the question that Monsieur Giguère asked, and he ran out of time, it went too far over for me to allow an answer. The committee has now agreed to allow that time, so if one of you would just provide a brief answer to Monsieur Giguère's question, we'd very much appreciate it.
Of course, I'll attempt to do that.
Very good.
I believe the question related to in a general sense, the complexity and growing complexity of the tax system, and specifically to the disability tax credit as an example of that. I think in terms of the complexity of the tax system, I can't sit here and tell you it's not a complex tax system. Any tax system is complex in that it's the application of somewhat complicated rules to extremely complicated and economic and social activities. So to some extent, there's an inevitability about complexity. But we do look, one of the kind of considerations we look in looking at a specific tax measure or the tax system as a whole is a balancing of a number of considerations. So, for example, its relevance in addressing a policy objective, its effectiveness in doing so, its economic efficiency, equity considerations, well, in terms of vertical equity and horizontal equity, its simplicity in terms of its simplicity for our colleagues at CRA to administer, and more importantly, it's the compliance burden it places on individuals. Any tax policy consideration requires a balancing of those considerations, and simplicity is an important one. In the context of a measure such as the disability tax credit, this is a generous measure in the context of the tax system, and it's focused on people who are suffering severe mental or physical impairment. So it's important that it be appropriately targeted, because if it wasn't, it would be extraordinarily expensive. So it needs to be targeted to the appropriate group of people who unfortunately suffer from those impairments. So there have to be rules, and that's inevitable. I think our colleagues at CRA make great efforts to try and explain those rules, not in legislative language, but in language that's accessible to people. But I guess the point I'm making is that there's complexity is to some extent inevitable, but the search for simplicity should continue. So I hope that's helpful.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thanks to the committee. Just one quick question, not so much on this, but relative to the whole issue of tax expenditures. The Economist just did a major front-page story on tax-free debt, making the case that the ability to deduct interest payments on debt is a little unknown problem. It's a ticking time bomb sort of within the world economy. By the way, no one has to answer this. I'm just asking it just for any feedback if it's there. And they make the case that it's so damaging that it's why Britain has moved from the American style, being allowed to deduct your mortgage payment interests, to the Canadian style where you're not. And they make the case on the corporate side that it would be worthwhile, and this is the question I'm asking, whether anyone here agrees or has any thoughts. The Economist was making the argument that switching from allowing debt to be deducted, interest to be deducted, and moving more, even if you change the tax rate to make it revenue neutral, would be an improvement in the way that we run our national economies. And I wonder if anybody had any thoughts on, because that is tax expenditures. Anytime that there's a tax deduction, we're talking about the same as spending money. I just wonder if anybody has any thoughts on that as to whether you see it as an issue. Is it anything being talked about in the Canadian context? Or quite frankly, nobody talked about it? Anybody even see the article? I'm just kind of throwing it out there to see if there's any take-up.
It was an interesting article, and I thought the blog afterwards was even more interesting in terms of the difference of views on that particular aspect, and I think it was indicative of that it's a complex issue. Specifically on the deductible mortgage interest payments, I think the evidence would probably show that countries who provide that, it gets capitalized in the price of houses, so it becomes a bit of a zero-sum game.
It's artificially raising the price, and that's why Britain moved away from it. Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. I just wanted to get that off my chest, given we were talking about tax expenditures. So I see no other interventions, and so I will, on behalf of the committee, thank our Auditor General and his staff and our guests here today. And we appreciate your answers. And by the way, the action plan was here in on time, in advance. Much appreciated. Good job. Thank you. And with that, this committee now stands adjourned. Thank you all.